Hello, happy Canzine, everyone. I'm super pleased today to welcome Dr. Amanda Rogers, who is an internationally recognized expert on global media, political violence, and social movements, and also the writer for Issue 91's cover story, which is about hate zines or skinhead zines in the 80s and 90s and what we can learn about the hate movements that are abounding and abundant today, looking back at those zines and that media. She is a assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Hobart William Smith, and she's currently writing a book about the white supremacist movement's strategic infiltration of law enforcement and the military. And she is also a Twitter goddess, I think is probably like appropriate. Follow her at Miss Entropy. It's a wild ride. You won't regret it. That's how I first found Amanda, and I'm really glad you took this piece on.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for having me for this and asking me to write the piece. I had a blast doing it and actually learned a lot in the process, so it's really nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited we get to do this kind of one-on-one call or event because it's like I can bring to the table what I know about zines, but I feel like you know endless amounts about the white supremacist movements and also just about propaganda and about violence. And so I'm kind of curious for you when you first kind of got into this piece and you started opening these zines, like what did you see? What did you find when you opened that zine? Both like actually what's on the page, but also how did you kind of interpret it?
Well, I mean, there's several things actually that I learned in the process of doing the research, and then several things that I already knew, but that came into sort of like crystallized into different realizations, I guess. So it was a really helpful research sort of project for me for my other work. But, one thing I think is interesting to consider is the fact that, when we think about zine culture in general, right? And what does that mean? How do adherents to it or participants in it think about being part of the counterculture and crafting or like carving out their own space, parallel to like institutionalized publishing industries? We often, I think, speak about the counterculture and being subversive and rejecting the status quo as if those are inherently like positive things, instead of really value neutral, and they can be applied in really horrific ways, right? I think very few people think about the fact that racist skinheads had a thriving zine sort of subculture. I mean, I don't think it was nearly as pronounced as other forms of publications that the white supremacist movement has engaged in, but it definitely was there. And the fact that it came out of punk rock is something that I think is really striking, that people should carefully consider. The fact that younger people that get involved in subcultural spaces are at a point in their lives where I'm not going to talk about like radicalization because I hate that term. I think it's pretty useless, right? But when you're in need of a community, and when you're seeing things around you that definitely are worth rejecting about society, that we have to think about the ways in which these cultural spaces and communities can be created and exploited basically from the outside, instead of just lauding them as necessarily positive from the jump. I think that's something interesting that came up. Another thing that struck me when I started doing this research on zines was how similar the same approach to building a subculture for white supremacist kids, I mean, I'm using kids right in a colloquial sense, so like through their 30s,
right,
is to Telegram, and it's to things like e-streamers today, which isn't something that I would ordinarily have thought of. It's definitely not a realization that I had, but even down to why neo-Nazis use patches right today for their backpacks, and like Boogaloo Boys have them on all their gear. They're sold in very similar ways as they were in skinhead zines from the early days. So I mean, that's just a couple of among many.
People in the zine scene don't even think about this because there is such a sense of belonging as you describe, and that rejection of the status quo is so constantly framed as giving a voice to the marginalized, but like margins are 360. Punk being this brash and just all out rejection of kind of almost anything and everything allowed for a lot of people to either exploit that or inherit that through white supremacy. And I wonder, you point out sort of the difference between the British and the American zines, and the punk movements in general. Like, that there was kind of a deeper connection to the British far right movement that existed previous at first, and then when it kind of migrated back to the States, that was a sort of different family building in a way. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, like, you know, who was making these zines, but then also who was benefiting from that culture. What power players were there in the wings?
For sure. There's a couple things that come up like directly in response to a statement that you made. You talked about marginalization being 360, and I think, and there's that, and then you also made a comment about how, you know, the communities that are built from these subcultures are so strong, right? That we don't often think about concomitant sort of communities also having, you know, having resonance or whatever. There's something really important to consider about people that are coming from an anti-racist perspective, explicitly looking at these phenomenon. And I'm putting myself right in the as the first offender, basically. Sometimes it's really tricky to understand the white supremacist movement as an outsider, because there, of course, you bring a moralizing view to it, right? It's tough to not see people involved as anything but monsters. I'm not doing an apologetic sort of move here. I'm just talking about pure rational calculus of strategy, understanding, and, you know, countering. Like, basically, there are so many similar dynamics that would not occur to you as providing meaning and fulfillment to these people, right? Because we see it all through the frame of something that's morally abhorrent to us. Specifically, the idea of marginalization, I think, is really apt, because I run into a lot of people talking about issues like, you know, people excluded from the status quo, and how can white folks that get into white supremacy, you know, go down this road? They're delusional. I mean, I would concur with that on the face of my work, right? Everything that I see, what I consider to be reality. But at the same time, that's not really a productive line of countering and thinking through how they get there and how they're sustained in these spaces. Because the idea of being a marginalized group is very, very real from their perspectives, right? So affective culture and ties of affiliation and belonging and, you know, music and all of these things are incredibly strong in sustaining that reality for them. So I think we have to be careful at all times to acknowledge that we're embedded in, you know, systemic rejection of this stuff in ways that sometimes can blind us to solutions that will be apparent after, you know, assuming their perspective, right? Like looking at it the way that they see it. So that's just something I wanted to throw out there, that I have a problem with it all the time, you know. But that's something that comes to mind, I think. And on that, the question of transnational networks is really, really important. I'm glad you asked it. So in the UK, I think I point this out in the piece, you had British nationalists kind of co-opting the skinhead scene and the music scene somewhat, right? In the US, you had Metzger doing the same thing. I think one of the big splits between the American skinheads and the British skinheads is you had a different conception of race and nation that was at play, right? You had a different historical foundation for the country, a different way of reckoning with who belongs as a citizen and how does that relate to the politics of, you know, quote, blood and soil, in a lot of really interesting ways with important ramifications. The youth movement in the white supremacist sort of, you know, history has always periodically been co-opted by leadership organizations. That's certainly the case, you know, I mean, Hitler Youth comes to mind, right? The KKK had like Boy Scout camps, basically. But something that's new, I think, about the American scene and the co-optation of the skinheads versus the British scene is, you had people like Metzger, for example, who I think is more emblematic of this than anyone else in the movement, who embraced the skinheads, right? And didn't try to bring them all under the umbrella of one specific movement organization, but rather, I would say, being open to youth culture and understanding that phase of life, right? Where violence can be sort of tapped and directed without trying to over control, is something that he was like a Machiavellian evil genius about, you know, being just hands off enough and just controlling enough, or directing, I guess is a better word, that you had a certain element of society, like the young people, the youth culture, being co-opted and directed in ways that even I don't think their members saw themselves as being directed through. Like one of Metzger's ex-disciples told me one time, I'll never forget this because we were talking about, Metzger's approach to the lone wolf and violence and whatever in relation to skinheads. And he said that Metzger's real genius was basically in presenting ideas and routes and avenues for violent action, and I mean otherwise, and making it feel like it was your idea, and then lauding the fact that you came up with it, right? And that's a lot more devastating, I think, in the long run when you're talking about mobilizing young people into a particular political trajectory, right? They're going to rebel regardless. And if they're in a rebellious subculture, if you try to directly control and provide programmatic dictates, that's going to backfire. But Metzger was a hell of a lot more successful because he recognized the power of adolescence and the power of youth subcultures and rebellion for what they were and how they could be tapped into in the most dangerous way. One thing that's really important about that too is that when Metzger started, embracing the skinheads, he also was more instrumental and programmatic than any other movement leader about cultivating the same sort of ties transnationally. This wasn't just in, from like a British context to the States. Metzger actively worked to export this in other countries like Sweden and in Germany. And in fact, that these pipelines were so strong because of channels that he built that, because Germany has been careful about, monitoring fascist materials that are disseminated. Metzger used to have people that ran the skinhead networks in Sweden smuggle into Germany white power material from the States. So that's something I think.
Well, it seems like what also comes out of that with that the thing that bridges it from subculture to like a movement that is like people are willing to kill and die for, feels like it is that idea of coalition almost, where it's like Metzger is not us if we're skinheads, but there seems like there's this mutual admiration. And I think it was, and sorry, we should also and we can edit it in, but like let me finish my thought and then we'll go there. Metzger had this famous quote about calling the skinheads the shock troops of the white supremacist movement, right? And you brought that into the piece, and I think it's instructive because we think about today some of the sort of like edgelord culture that then becomes propaganda, that then becomes terrorism or whatever you want to call it. That is like born out of somebody like Metzger, who was a leader that preceded the skinhead movement, seeing an opportunity to provide a sense of importance and a sense of weight to what was also just like, for some people, like boozing and like going to punk shows and whatever. And that is an incredible talent, as you point out. But I think we should also just
jump on, because I don't want this to go past, right? But it's also really, really effective for plausible deniability, right? Like there's a utility to the leadership that especially apparent now in terms of you don't have a direct affiliation with like the Republican Party on its face and 4chan, right? But you absolutely do have people behind the scenes in these contexts reaching out to some of these kids, right? And working with them. And it's more than just like an efficacious strategy for like inciting violence, right? But masking those ties by reaching out to young people and then doubling down on the shock troops and the uncontrollable youth element. You can always distance yourself in ways that's, strategically brilliant and pretty fucking evil also.
So say more about that. Like, what is that distancing where you say like, well, I didn't know, like that sort of thing, or where you're 2 degrees away, or?
I think, I use the skinhead shock troops quote because I think it's really, it's kind of emblematic in some ways, but I also think that it gets misunderstood. People throw that particular excerpt out a lot as if the skinheads were brought into Metzger's white Aryan resistance as explicitly affiliated, right? That's not what shock troops should imply at all. I don't think it was. It's more like your paramilitary, not even your paramilitary armed force.
They're berserkers, They're like
your shooters. You know what I mean? Like basically. So it's more of like that kind of a connection, and I think it's particularly effective when you look at ideology that is shared across like the trolling environment and policy platforms of groups like the GOP, right? There is considerable similarity and concurrence. The packaging of the message is different, And if it appears from kids in a meme format, right, on 4chan, there's the deniability of saying, like, this, this isn't the Republican Party's play. It's not on the platform. Where the hell are you getting this? This is just kids trying to shock you and offensive, whatever. But a lot of these things are deliberately crafted from the top and then sent out to those levels, and filter back up through the culture. So one way to think about this is the It's Okay to Be White flyer campaign.
Yeah, say more about that, because that was huge in Toronto.
Okay, so this was it was especially huge on the northeast coast in the States. But basically, in I want to say 2018, about a year after the Pittsburgh or the Tree of Life massacre, you had a bunch of trolls on 4chan and elsewhere disseminate this poster that just white background, all of a sudden black font was "It's okay to be white," right? The objective here, strategically, is really damn smart. It's put that out, and on the face of it, it's so innocuous that you're going to bait someone into overreacting in ways that allow you to jump into the space of, well, what's wrong with being like a white person, right? This is demonizing someone from their skin color. You're being a hypocrite, and this is the problem with the left. You're being racist in your language of anti-racism, right? That's the reaction that they want. And that's unfortunately what happened a lot of the time when these flyers were put up at different universities. I was at a university at the time in the Northeast, and I was in so many discussions and arguments with administrators and student groups who wanted a different reaction by groups to the posters. What they wanted, this made me so angry. One of the administration people at my former university said they wanted to put up posters, counter postering all over campus that said things like, "It's okay to be white, it's okay to be brown, it's okay to be black, it's not okay to be racist." Like that's the dumbest Kumbaya misguided.
So like nonprofit, like just university.
It's corporate Democrat, bullshit world of like, let me advertise the CIA with my sassy Latina advertisement that came out yesterday.
Oh, I didn't see that.
It's so misguided. Oh god, it's awful. It's like, to encapsulate, it's basically, imagine, a School for the Americas, but feminist.
Right. Okay.
Anyway.
Oh my god.
So.
But it's like a story time messaging about something that is not story time.
Basically, yeah, you've got like what becomes very problematic with the flyering campaign is people are not seeing the umbrella of something called the movement in terms of shared perspectives, number one, and in terms of ways that those overlap with establishment civil discourse acceptable sort of rhetoric. But more than that, I think there's I won't say that, but a lot of the left, our repeat problem is like the left infights, right? Eats each other or whatever. But there's a big problem with a lack of strategy in terms of foresight, right? And ideological purity is kind of like a litmus test. And I think something that I want to just get out in every single interview I do about this is that people need to calibrate strategic responses, right? I understand the impetus behind getting really angry about the It's Okay to Be White flyers and having a protest and having, all of that loud, public, visible reaction that a lot of people say is necessary to make communities of color and marginalized folks feel welcome and embraced. That's true, right, to an extent. However, there's also significant truth and honestly expedience to considering where it came from, how it's meant to operate, and what it's meant to produce, and not producing what it's meant to produce, right? Like the loud counter reaction to language like that automatically sets you up to prove the point, right? That instead of an argument for anti-racism, what you're really pushing is anti-white, like you're proving their point when you overreact to stuff like that. And that's not a 4chan troll that came up with it, on their own accord. There were actively white supremacists pushing it. A more recent version, I think, or corollary is this super straight stuff that's going around everywhere. Like, I have screenshots from Telegram of people saying, when you put this up, make sure that you give it to normies without the neo-Nazi connection. We don't want talking about this in open Telegram channels.
Right.
And I posted it on Twitter, and then I had a bunch of, my typical
Naysayers.
lovely followers, yeah,
Yeah.
who jumped on, and they were like, "Oh, this is bullshit. Like, you're just, trying to paint the whole whatever the hell it's supposed to be with like a broad brush or whatever." But the point is, when you expose the underpinnings of that process, I think it's a lot more effective
Mm-hmm.
than falling into the trap that they've set for you. And a lot of
Mm.
this whole strategic program comes from the disconnected sort of leaderless resistant youth culture spaces that, or in terms of, scare quotes, that we think of as 4chan and not actually the movement. But
Mm-hmm.
that is understanding ecology in terms of media and strategy in these
Mm.
campaigns is a lot more effective than mobilizing a visible response in ways that make you feel emotionally proactive,
Right.
but in terms of the longue durée aren't going to work.
You make a good point that, and we can't presume that everyone watching this considers themselves a leftist, but the Broken Pencil milieu is definitely going to be surprised to know this much about skinhead zines mostly, and I think that like there's what you bring out about proactive politics versus reactive politics and sort of like activism on the left is a good point in the sense that for many reasons, but it's like when you're constantly reacting to things and your reaction is exactly what was intended to provoke, there's no strategy, but there's also just like a conflation of things that are connected as being the same, and that is really dangerous because what you bring out and call an ecology, I think, is really smart, is like these movements are not the same. They may have shared goals, but the people, the tactics, the media, the propaganda is not actually the same thing. And that's if you start to react to something that is intended to either provoke a response or entice somebody like interested in being transgressive more and more and more and more until they find themselves pretty deep. If you react that way, then it sort of just like makes that narrative and that story and that very like living and relational aspect to this movement go completely away and be just like hate is out there and we have to say no when we see it, which is very short-sighted, I think.
I said it's like the Band-Aid solution. And I also think that, like, I want to throw this out here because I actually got a lot more focused on that kind of strategic counter thinking because I used to work on ISIS. I mean, I still do to an extent, but I want to throw this out here because I didn't want to work on ISIS. I started working on ISIS because was supposed to go to Syria with a friend of mine that was a journalist, and I skipped out. He ended up getting beheaded in one of the propaganda videos, one of the American journalists, right? And I was friends with another guy that was in that same group that died. And I bring this up because, when I've always been an activist working in spaces of representation and politics, and what does that mean, and what does it do in terms of media? But when I was confronted with this, and I never wanted to work on terrorism, like anything, but when I was confronted with that stuff, and I actually saw the video accidentally, which is the long story, I recognized in me this horrible impulse of provocation like successfully happening in ways that horrified me, in terms of like the all out like seeing red, wanting to immediately speaking like burn Syria, and who cares about collateral damage, like that popped into my head. That's not something I ever want consciously, but I'm asking myself, like, why the hell did I react like that to this video? Because I won't get into this, but the videos are like a lot less bloody and graphic than most jihadi propaganda and most, violence. So what was it about this particular, video, other than that I knew the person because I've seen a lot of people die? Basically what jumped out was there is a calibrated approach to the production of this material that is meant to enrage people in particular ways that go against what they would do on like a conscious basis, right, with logical thinking behind it, but also in that emotional bait, it's meant to completely blind you to the fact that it's even that it's even possible that the person on the other side could be so calculating as to do it. And so I started working on ISIS because I was like, shit, what's going on here is that this group has basically set it up in such a way that they want anyone who's come up in like a Western media environment with particular images of whose life matters, and who counts as like fully human, to react in the exact manner that I did. And if my entire work is predicated on understanding these dynamics, and for a second it worked on me, what the hell does that mean for someone that has never met like a brown person or never met a Muslim, right? That has to be looked at. And that I think really has helped me in understanding and thinking through why a lot of the neo-Nazis do the things that they do. So to bridge that right now, crystallize, one of the things that I grew to work on about the so-called Islamic State is their strategy of basically what they call eradicating the gray zone. It's the exact same thing that white supremacists do, where essentially what you want to do is destroy any space of coexistence, right, between your group and whatever the group that you're fighting is. And you can do this by putting them in situations like your interest group, like so putting your white people in this case in a situation where if you attack them and do like a false flag, they're going to become conscious of the things you're warning them about and come to you for protection, right? And then it instigates like a cycle of revenge violence that drives a wedge between different communities and leads increasingly over time to not just polarization, but a segmented sort of society. It's exactly what Zarqawi did in Iraq to turn what was an insurgency into a civil war. And it's exactly what neo-Nazis do and have done. So one example of this is TJ Leiden was a skinhead that worked with Metzger back in the 80s and 90s. And he talks a lot about the fact that one recruitment strategy that he would do is he'd sneak into, or he'd have kids sneak into high schools that were in mixed areas. And especially like there was a kid that knew the high school in particular, and they would put hate literature in the lockers of minority students, right? What they were hoping to do was cause a fight and basically get the white kids blamed and instigate these cycles of fighting to where, you know, these white kids would then basically walk outside and run into skinheads outside. They could tell about this, who would be surprised and offer to, you know, provide them security. And that was one of the ways that they recruited in Southern California in the late 80s and early 90s was really effective. That's exactly how ISIS works, right? And that's why the whole ban on immigration, for example, is so dangerous from Muslim countries, because what you end up doing accidentally when you're blind to these dynamics is supporting things that are the policy objectives of both like radical neo-Nazis and groups like the so-called Islamic State, who hate each other, but they operate in symbiosis, you know? So that's kind of what led me to look at a lot of this stuff and think through the strategy of reaction and overreaction and how it relates to what groups that want polarization are doing to enact that, and how we're conscripted, I think, and recruited without even knowing it in fights on the side of the people that we oppose.
I think that's a profound insight, and I think that if you spent the rest of your life telling that to everyone every time you spoke to anyone, that would be a good thing. Like, it's so important. It's the crux that this propaganda, it's not the same thing. The people who are meant to be provoked are not responding to the same thing at all as the people who are being recruited.
Exactly.
Because the disaffected kid who just feels persecuted because somebody accused him of being racist, being welcomed by skinheads, sees a utopia, right? Like sees something, sees a promise there. Whereas somebody and sees that in a zine. You see, like there's these like social pages in the zine where they're all just like, hey, here's like Mary over here, and she's like a cool skinhead, and she's with her friend Bob in whatever small British town. Don't you want to come hang out, basically? And then the next page is full of swastikas. Same thing where it's like, you know, we see that, or I might see that, and if I don't check myself and put on my media studies glasses, it's like I'm upset. My stomach hurts, you know? Yeah. And it's like, that's what they want. It's precisely, and it's not always, we're not even always getting the exact same media. Some of those zines aren't interesting.
And I love that you brought this out, because one of the things that, you know, I always tell my students, or I told my students when I was teaching at universities, when I was a professor, if you look at ISIS, right? Like, and I used to do this cruelly to them all the time. I would put up an ISIS propaganda, you know, video. Don't freak out, people, not one with bloodshed. Not tell them what it was. Play a few clips and say, like, what do you think this is? And most of the time they think it was Al Jazeera, like an Al Jazeera news segment. And it's supposed to be that way, because, and I would ask them too, like, shut your eyes. So tell me, raise your hand if you think that more ISIS propaganda is about violence than anything else. Everyone's hands would go up, right? But ISIS propaganda is violence is like this much, right? Images of like it's a lovely multiracial society away from like American oppression of Muslims where you can come and have a great life. That's the majority, right? And that's the stuff that we never see. But when the media picks up like an execution video like that of my friends, our impression is that they're the most deadly, the most violent, the most horrific threat that we face. All our resources have to go into that, right? Because it grabs our attention that way. And that's deliberate, and it's really, really smart, and it's incredibly effective. The same thing I think is true in a lot of ways for certain neo-Nazi groups. But I also want to make the point that if those of us in activist spaces and those of us opposed to these dynamics have to be really aware of the way in which we analyze and parse our responses according to audience in the same way. Like take a page from the playbook, because I've spoken to groups like RCMP before over this issue on recruitment style stuff from ISIS and versus white supremacists or whatever, and people that you would think like organizationally are more conservative. And if there's a way basically that you can calibrate the approach in that same clinical outside, like I don't care if you hate all Muslims on the face of the earth. What I'm saying is realize the way that if you hate ISIS and you think they're terrible, that they're using that to basically help themselves win. So you don't want to help them. Even if you hate Muslims, don't say that in public, because that's an ISIS talking point. Like when you approach it from that perspective, right? You can make an impact among people that are your opponents, right? In other political ways. And I think there's a lot that can be done in the white supremacist sort of anti-countering movement the same way. So these are things we should give equal attention to outside of just what they are doing is bad and we need to stop it, but the how and why, and be as strategically calculating and smart about it as they are.
Yeah, I think that's a wise, obviously, like I agree really wholeheartedly with that. And I emphasize that point because I think it's so smart and it really is also like humbling. You really have to just like look at how you react and also look at how all of this stuff is, as you said, affective. And it's like our feelings about these things have more to do with this than any specific history or whatever. Like it's this longing to belong to you're a collective, to the tribe, to the state, to the nation, to the race, to whatever group, and that can be fractured really, really, really effectively through media.
And I think like think that we're the good guy.
Totally, and that's why the persecution complex bears out our self-righteousness, right? And so it's like, and I think
like I don't want to let this drop, so I'm going to jump in real quick because I know I'll forget it. When you had said the thing at the beginning about like our embeddedness in some of these networks makes us blind to like how things operate in other networks, I think that's a really key point here I want to emphasize, because it's I think even harder for people who are supposed to be experts or supposed to be activists to see how our blind spots in this fight actually hurt what we're trying to do. So one thing that I mean, like I'm always, when this is sort of a link with your humility point, like I'm always trying to ask myself, how would I react in other situations and challenge my assumptions that are like naturally right and like my morality code. And what I mean by that is, example, one of the last interviews that I gave, this always happens, but I only noticed it in the last interview. Someone said something like, all this stuff has comes at such a great cost to you personally, like your security. Why do you do it, right? And normally I spout off about how, you don't really have a choice if you want to blah, blah, blah. But I never sat with the aftermath in the same way, because this time, for whatever reason, my first response was, if I presented like a Black woman, if you visibly thought that I had like Black ancestry, would you ask me that question? Like, and they stopped, and there's kind of like crickets, and I didn't mean it as an attack, right? But I sat and thought with that for a long time afterwards, because the thing is, I get very irritated with the idea that anti-racist or, whatever the case may be, should get cookies for like what they do, right? I don't think that I think it should be expected, right? But more than that, when we're so focused, everybody wants a good story, everybody wants the redemption story, right? But I think we forget that when someone is like, oh, putting their lives on the line, that supposedly has a choice, right, that could opt out of it, you're asking someone that's already facing those penalties to carry the burden of getting rid of them and fighting the problem. But
right.
in our
Brush it off
effective
eating.
desire
And I think
for
that
like redemption stories and bravery, we don't understand that that very premise, right, just hides the problem and masks it. And that's the problem with the power of white supremacy as a systemic thing and as strategic calculus, is that's exactly where it gets its power from, is invisibility, you know? So yeah, I think that we have to always hold up a mirror, you know, every single assumption like that. And it's exhausting, but it's really, I think, the only hope, you know? It's really, I think, the only hope, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Courage alone is not going to do it. You know, like it's like, and I think that is like in this moment, like I have seen incredible acts of courage in activist circles and moments, and they matter.
Yeah.
But it is courage with strategy is lasting in a lot of ways that you don't see. And like I think there's totally a room for, you know, spontaneity and response and whatever. But what you said about the invisibility, I think like when you only respond to what you see, you're just feeding what you don't. And I think that has a lot to do with like the medium of the zine versus, and I want to get into some of the digital stuff you do in Telegram and all that, because I think the medium really matters in terms of like the conversation that people who are outside of these movements have about it. And it's like me looking at these zines, the way I found the way this whole story sort of started was, of course, we're all paying attention to white supremacists now, and you know, especially after January 6th, suddenly like my mom cares about this, you know, and
yeah, it's the
like,
window of opportunity.
Yeah, and bless her heart, you know, I'm so glad. But like, I remember it was a little bit before that I was just like being a zine nerd on archive.org, and I was just looking at like the general zine collection in no particular order, and noticing that like every 20th zine was a neo-Nazi zine, and like not just neo-Nazi zines, but like O9A zines, but also like skinhead punk zines, and like everything in between, and some kind of recent. And some that had been downloaded thousands of times. And so it was like, wow, there's this, you know, there's this archive here, and I had not thought about these things at all. Talk about invisible. And then looking at them, I felt like I wasn't supposed to be reading them, not just because I felt like, oh my God, what if the person that's not here in the room thinks I'm a Nazi, you know, like that sort of guilt of reading things that you feel are naughty, you got to put away and look at it. These are like what we were describing about the happy people in pictures and punk shows and loyalty and the sense of nationalism that gave people great sense of purpose in the 80s and 90s, where everything was falling apart around everyone in the States and in Britain, really. That is like a super different medium to show that and to revisit many years later, compared to something like Telegram that is nonstop and that is also affective, but you don't even have time to process it.
Yeah.
Still, it produces a sense of belonging for some and a sense of horror for others. Like, how does that work is what I want to know.
How's the affective belonging created?
Like, they're so different and yet both so effective. Like, they're being used really well.
Well, I think, you know, part of it is there's several reasons that it's so effective. Number one, I mean, you know, it's just human nature that if something is rare, like the culture of scarcity, right? And the like hipster shit of being the first one to discover something, like how in-groups and out-groups are created in a lot of ways, right? Something that is obscure, that's outside the mainstream, that's more difficult to get involved in or come across, there's a certain cachet in that. And that's the heart of how a lot of subculture, social capital kind of works. So there's that. There's also what happens in those spaces as far as like creating, you know, inside jokes and things like that. Those are other ways in which affective ties are sort of built and reconstituted. And the act, I think, of people don't think about like ritual in relation to print culture or in relation to a lot of other stuff. But basically, when you seek out a subcultural space in like rejection of the status quo, seeking that out and participating in whatever way gives you like a dopamine hit of the action of rebelling, right? So it makes you feel like you're doing something, you know, even if that doing something isn't a physical act. And through the act of repetition, that sort of becomes subsumed into your patterns of behavior. Like, I'm not trying to get into like Bourdieu theoretical, you know, academic jargon, but basically repetition, you know, is one thing.
Yeah.
And a culture, a community culture in which the boundaries are policed for authenticity, right? There's this security sort of check element in that for groups like white supremacists and also marginalized groups that we don't think about this normally, I think, in terms of like, how do we know that you're not a cop, right? In activist circles, there's lingo that people use that can set them apart. Haircuts, right? That dude carries himself like a Fed, right? There are signals about whether or not you belong. And the longer you've participated in these spaces, the more you're able to embody and perform that in ways that are cues to other members. So I think that's another important element of how these things work. And also
Those
these are
codes,
networking spaces. What? Sorry.
just those codes, you know, like I think about
Yeah.
Telegram, how like I can't understand half of that babble because it just makes
Lucky.
no sense. I can't follow the memes, man. Like I don't even like really know what the hell. Like it's just like there's all this shorthand. Whereas with the zines, you see a little bit less. There's less shorthand and more what you call plausible deniability, where there's a lot of talk about nationhood and a lot of. Eventually, they get pretty like. By the time you get to like the Hammerskins putting their zines out, like they had like a huge small press in the 90s.
Yep.
Like this is the big American skinhead gang, the Hammerskins. They you know, they were just talking about exactly how they felt. And so was Tom Metzger.
Well, I want to pause you there because I do a lot of work specifically on Metzger and his network. And this is something that I want people to keep in mind as far as like when we think about, you know, how things are phrased and we think about how interested people are now at this moment that will pass unless we stop it from passing about the dynamics of white supremacy. There's a danger in considering this a right-left issue. And considering this, what I mean by that, like people look at the Capitol and they talk about white supremacy as like a Trump phenomenon when, you know, if you use a little bit of historical perspective, Trump's a symptom. And this has been going on a long time. It's been invisible yet again, right? But this is a moment where it was visible. And if we don't confront the fact that there's continuity, it's going to come up again later, right? You're not getting rid of the problem. It's kind of like having cancer. The doctor tells you it's there. You don't go back to have it checked out. And then the next thing you know, it metastasizes, right? You've got this pattern sort of. So specifically with relation to partisan dynamics and a left-right sort of perception, because the skinhead movement and Metzger's circle in particular, it's interesting. Third positionism draws from the left and right, you know, it's rejected entirely the right-wing establishment. So you miss like half of the organizational and recruitment principles of neo-Nazi movements when you think in terms of like a right-wing or a left-wing thing. So there's one thing or two things about invisibility. But also, it's super important to point out that for Metzger in particular, and this is one rare area where he was really smart, the idea of, you know, him being like putting it all out there and you knew exactly what he thought, that's true to an extent. But that was one side of what Metzger was up to. If you look at his other publications that were only, you know, movement only, more obscure, and things that he told people that were followers, right? At the same time as you have bold in your face, like racial slur, you also have the same person sending in operatives to infiltrate Border Patrol and INS and the police and the military. And we know this because he was on record saying it, but his own persona, you know, being boldly racist and saying it's time for revolution, there's no political solution, and, you know, advocating violence is a deflection and a distraction. And it worked extraordinarily well. And Metzger was one of the few smart enough to actually do that. That's not the case across the board. But just because you see extremely violent, open, bold rhetoric from someone that's in a leadership position doesn't mean that you can assume there's not an invisible machination going on alongside, because it's even stronger when you have that. And again, that is specific to particular people and backed up by things that we can track, not like a Red Scare sort of approach. So I think those are other things that come up with these issues of visibility and you know, exclusionary spaces and belonging, right? Infiltration is a key example of working within those frameworks and outside of them.
That's thank you for really hammering that home, because I think I don't know Metzger's work very well, and you know, we probably should have mentioned it earlier who Tom Metzger was. but
Oh,
prominent
now
California.
the founder of White Aryan Resistance. He started in Southern California. I passed away basically this fall. But he was one of the big white supremacist OGs, I guess, from the contemporary movement in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And a lot of people, he was the guy that mobilized sort of skinhead angst or whatever you would call it. The important thing about Metzger is that he's kind of a node that people don't recognize as a connection point between the new generation and the old generation, because he was one of the last alive too. And he's really misunderstood by a lot of experts on this stuff as, just in that space of being loud and, not operating in more subtle ways. So,
but you bring up a good point though, which is that for me as somebody less familiar with Metzger's work, I went and found an archival copy of the WAR newspaper. Yeah, exactly. Which is and then even more recent, up until the late 2000s, some of his kind of crappy digital looking publications.
Yeah, the Insurgent, and then the Paranoid Youth Network letter. Yeah,
precisely. And just reading that, I'm like, wow, this guy is not holding punches. But he also knew the distraction tactic well. I think about this with the quote unquote insurrection, which I'm sorry, insurrections are successful, and for me as somebody who's run in anarchist circles, hearing people talk about that very strange day at the Capitol as an insurrection misunderstands it as well, where it's I wonder how successful the people seeing that on TV would be in recruiting a possibly vulnerable young mind who might be interested, compared to what machinations, as you mentioned, might be happening in the background. I don't think it was maybe scary, it was alarming, but it wasn't particularly impressive after a certain point. It was kind of a very weird masculinity and just paranoia. And then people want to, people just kind of conflate. They're yeah, those are QAnon people, and they kind of wash out the racial politics, or they, there's all of this stuff going on there where it's people responded to that so much more viscerally and with so much more attention than to the literal massacres that keep happening.
Well, hold on. I will tell you why I think that is. I do think that there's a reason, right? That's beyond the language of insurrection or premeditation on the part of a lot of people that did go. There's a lot of, speaking again about invisibility and visibility. I don't think that the scene of people at the Capitol siege is what's meant to recruit, right? I think the backlash and the aftermath is what's the point of recruitment drives, because basically they piggybacked on the election fears, right, and conspiracy frameworks. I mean, you see this. Well, I'm gonna put a pin in that and come right back to it. Yeah. You see this in terms of disaffected QAnon people, specifically on Telegram, but also elsewhere. Talking about the election was stolen, whatever. Now they're so sad because the January 6th thing didn't work out. In the neo-Nazi channels, they're totally shredding the QAnon people, right? But they're also saying, go raid the channel, act nice, and use it to red pill them, right? So there's a calculated response to blend and work within these other grievances to rechannel people. But then on top of that, and again, this is a point about not being aware in your own political stance fully of how your reactions will be counterproductive. I'm sorry, but the people who are talking about how everyone that joins QAnon is crazy, and all these people who think that Trump is going to come back or whatever, they're just idiots and they're coping and they're sad and we should make fun of them. Yeah, I get why that's fun and enjoyable, but at the same time you're not understanding that that's exactly what the other darker sides of the world, you might want to say, are pushing for also and embracing as something that exploits polarization. So these kinds of aftermaths, it's insurgency 101. Honestly, you have an act that threatens the state at whatever level that doesn't succeed, right? But the state that feels threatened overreaches and in certain ways can attack civil liberties and crack down in a way that those who are the targets can effectively package that as being further marginalized, as it being a purge, and basically escalating a state of emergency mentality that is really effective for mobilization. And I think that's
Right.
what we have with Aftermath of the Capitol. So it's not watching on TV the siege itself, it's watching how lawmakers are framing the inquiry into it. And I don't mean the lawmakers who are saying we need to investigate extremism in the military. I think they can do a smarter job of justifying that, but that's a different way or a different thing. I'm talking about like the really, really cynical language of, the right wing that's saying there is no problem, that it wasn't an insurrection, it was free speech, whatever, right?
Right.
And this is repression. And to really concretely hammer this home for you, the conversation nationally about investigating extremist ties in the military came out of the Capitol incident, right? And you've got a lot of blowback for it. You've got all of these people like, what's her name, Green and other right wingers in leadership roles talking about how an investigation of extremism is in the military is not about the problem of extremism. It's about a political purge of Trump supporters and the right specifically. That's like a huge talking point, right? And one thing people miss is, like I said before, third positionists, it's not a right or left wing thing. It's not a pro-Trump thing. That, like, the most dangerous infiltrators are not the ones that were at the Capitol, right? But also, so the inquiry that is now public about how far down should we look, right? How wide is the problem? Being co-opted or being exploited, I guess, by certain elements to say it's a partisan purge. This isn't new at all. And to a lot of people, it seems like it's new. But there is a connection and a flashback to an earlier period in history that isn't just a parallel, it's a direct line to what happened at the Capitol. The Oath Keepers, 2009, and the DHS report on right-wing extremism. So to be as concise as possible, in 2009, Department of Homeland Security had an internal memo about far-right mobilization and specifically the issue of targeting law enforcement and military. And that report, you can find it now, and it's really innocuous in the language. It doesn't say everyone is in the military is, a Nazi, but basically there's a targeting effort going on. Well, within like 2-3 days of that report being complete, it was leaked to a far right, not far right, but like a really not mainline conservative talk show, and it was framed as Obama and the left wing saying that people in the military are scary, Nazi racist extremists. And that's an attack on patriotism. And this is an attack on, the right wing generally, because it's like Obama and the radical Democrats, which is hilarious. Anyway, yeah, right. It was taken up and it was inflamed by people like Rush Limbaugh, Michelle Malkin. This is when you had I'm a proud right wing extremist crop up as like a slogan in conjunction with the Tea Party. But why this matters to the Capitol and why it's really, really, really crucial to understand is that the Oath Keepers claimed credit for leaking it, not publicly. Basically, it first leaked onto an Oath Keepers forum before the Oath Keepers themselves had announced publicly that they existed. And they claimed to have infiltrators at DHS in 2009. Well, the outcome of this is that Napolitano, responding to basically the publicity blitz and the partisan fighting, apologized for the report, had it retracted, and then Obama's Homeland Security shuttered the office responsible for monitoring right-wing extremism in the United States. As a result, the Oath Keepers, who announced their presence right after this stuff, then end up left alone until they're able to be the ones, actively at the heart of the conspiracy on January 6th. So
yeah, that really brings it all together in a way. Like, it synthesizes the way that that policy, state actors, and then also politics, like the performance, the messaging, whatever, is all at play on this like very micro macro scale that like we can use to understand things like January 6th. And I think
it's a warning to everybody. And I think this is where everyone has to be smarter about their approach and like convincing people to look at the problem. You're a lot of the time you are being played and exploited in ways you're not aware of by people that you would oppose if you knew what they were about. And that's straight up something that applies to a lot of mainstream right-wing conservatives that see critiques of extremism in the military as an attack on like patriotism. They don't know, a lot of them, that active neo-Nazis love this idea and have plotted, for you to fall for this. And I think,
and they refuse to believe it a lot of the time, right? Like there's a
that's where your pitch is really important. And I'll follow up on that in a sec.
Yeah. I think that like the 6th, what comes to mind for me with the January 6th thing was like that there was this hordes of people on Twitter, whether they were conservatives or Republicans or Trump people or whatever. It could be with many people who quickly started spreading the line that like, well, this isn't Trump people, this is Antifa.
Yeah.
And it's like you don't know which boogeyman or which clown to deploy in your rhetoric, and then it's like I say, oh, you're sort of worth from evidence, and yet here I am. It's like exactly what you're describing is like my own emotional response, my own personal affective position informs everything I think about it. So
all of us, totally, all of us. I think one thing that's super helpful, right? Your reaction watching that, like that's too, complex for whatever this other side that I am more supportive of to pull off, right? This is something really key with thinking about non-state armed groups in particular. Whether it's a group like ISIS or it's a group like, like Adamoth. Something that people are not cognizant enough, and I can tell you from firsthand experience from like working on these groups separately, right, with different parties, people don't think about the fact, like they'll make these assumptions that are wild, but on a surface level they make sense. Like why would ISIS be reading, like Mao? Because it's useful. Like, why would ISIS be using cell phones if they're like anti-technology? No, they're not. It's the efficacy. It's military strategy. It's how insurgency fucking functions. So studying the enemy, quote unquote, and any sort of conflict and the tactics and strategies that they use and adapting is how this stuff works. And our own affective, unexamined positions can backfire in thinking that stuff through. Like, oh, that couldn't be actually ISIS because the guy has a cell phone. This is stuff people think, right? Or there couldn't be like a useful, like a patsy or like an ally, like that was a person of color, like Enrique Tarrio and Proud Boys, right? Because XYZ. No, you're just limited in the way that you think and understand insurgency and its dynamics.
What you said about studying the enemy and what we're talking about, really putting our feelings aside whenever we can and looking at these things without making assumptions about how it works or why it's doing what it's doing.
Yeah.
I wanted to just kind of bring it back to like the Skinhead Zines channel up to now. Like what is it that we can just learn from looking at that, the print documents at the which I would include and extend to those posters that said it's okay to be white, like print is a particular thing, but just even looking at those early ones and the differences and the spread in the 80s and 90s, like what is it that we can take away from that and use to understand something going on today, if not everything?
I think that's a great question to sort of close with. And I think probably the biggest thing is that in and of themselves, there's nothing new that's going on in these spaces. What is different is basically the shrinking of geographical space and the escalation of speed and scale of information, right? So you have a difference in how information and links are transmitted and created, but the mechanisms and the spaces in which I'm not saying spaces in terms of like physical spaces, that's the area before, but like the objects, I guess, and material manifestations of like connection, right? Like patches and a celebrity figure like a musician or an Easter egg, like the same dynamics are at play, number one. And that's conscientious, it's not accidental, but that it's different in terms of how fast it spreads, how far, and how much of it can spread. Those are the differences and things that we really need to keep in mind. But as far as continuity, there's a lot of the same stuff deliberately because it works, right? But missing both of those kind of seemingly opposed trends, that same but different, right? When you aren't fully aware or cognizant of them, it misses the fact that there's institutional memory that builds up over time, right? So kids that get into, say, any of this by like listening to Skinhead music or stumbling on an e-streamer or whatever, over time are going to be encountering in those spaces older people from the movement who are saying, like, hail George Lincoln Rockwell, and then you're learning about the American Nazi Party in the States, right? That happens all the time on these spaces. Also, that the socialization element, whether it is online or at like a punk show where a skinhead band plays, people enter these spaces a lot of times not ideologically inclined to become violent or become even racist. They enter accidentally a lot of the time. Sometimes it's deliberate, and the socialization and the friendship and the jokes and all of those things actually has helped socialize them into a racism that wasn't there before, even if the signifiers of it are there, right? So think Susie and the Banshees, and like all the punk stuff from the 80s where you have the swastika, not because people are actually Nazis, right? Because they're trying to shock. That's edgelord trolling now. It doesn't mean dismiss it always as not important, but a lot of times things that are visibly acts of rebellion because they are counter the status quo, when coupled with an environment of camaraderie, can synthesize and lead to, over time, that kind of more activation and intensification and, I guess, internalization happening.
The figures that you point out, like the e-streamers on Telegram who do this weird game where they harass people on live.
Oh yeah, that's something to point out too. Yeah. When people on Telegram are talking about like what made them move from being like an edgelord to an actual national socialist in their own terms, so many of them say Catboy Cammy red pilled me, Gypsy Crusader red pilled me. They identify this as the channel that they came in through. Just like skinheads a lot of the time talk about Screwdriver was their entry, but it's recognized within the movement.
It's worth understanding like how these bridges, like you talk about, like somebody in that Telegram channel is going to encounter an older seasoned recruiter basically, but then there's bridge, there's the celebrity, there's the person, there's the excitement, there's the belonging, and it's like it just goes to show how like our admiration or our wanting to be, like our ability to align ourselves with somebody who looks cool, seems to have power, seems to be transgressive, overpowers like values and principles that we enter with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like what makes us feel good, basically, how do we feel like our existence matters and we're validated? And a lot of the time that is going to lead to certain political stances, I think, that are more completely embodied and performed by people because they're not aware that there's an effective element, drawing them in the first place. It's like you get over a phase in your life, like say you're a raver in high school, right? Maybe you're really embarrassed about it, and then later on you look back at it when you are embarrassed of it, and you can see it gave you something, but like the material manifestations passed, right? Because you were
the pictures don't look great, those pants maybe like were too big
and cool, like show an ex-skinhead their pictures of like their stupid bands in the 80s, and a lot of them will laugh at this material, even totally. About the ideology. Yeah.
But nostalgia may be there too, depends on how you grew up, where you went from there, and I think that's like
absolutely
all at play. Like the aesthetics you see in the skinhead zines, if I couldn't understand what the words and symbols meant, I might think it was a zine that I had in my teenage closet, like whatever. And I'm so good.
Like, take racism or anti-racism or politics completely out of it. Like when you see people looking at their wedding photos from 15 years before, and they're like, oh, that was such a great day. Holy shit, what was I wearing? I mean, it's that kind of a thing. Like the fashion, right, that those connections are forged in is something that can pass. But what drew people, whatever, I think it's worth considering, that so much of this operates on the level of the emotional. Not meaning that you're like subject to get brainwashed into it or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. But like our bonds can impact our politics, and that is something that applies to all of us, from whatever position you're coming from.
And I think like if there's any sort of matrix that I can draw out of this conversation, it's sort of like you've got the sense of oneself as having principles and the truth in front of you, but also like when really affect, belonging, whatever is at play. And then that's mapped against this visible, invisible, like here and now, and then like big picture scope question and scale that like makes it really slippery and difficult. And I think that like you've brought in a really good media studies sort of like I blended in with the sort of like very practical historical approach that I think is sorely missing, to be honest, from the conversations that you see in a lot of media. And that, like, you know, it comes down to things like zines. It comes down to things like Telegram. I'm so pleased to have had this conversation today and also in the magazine, because I think it will at least be instructive for me personally, even just to understand this stuff a little bit more, and hopefully for others as well.
You know, I learned a lot in the process. Like thinking about a lot of the stuff kind of came out of working in those spaces. Yeah, I think the last thing that I would say is that if this is just something that I think is always sharpened after every single piece that I publish or every talk that I give, whatever. The most useful interventions, I think, in any of this are holding yourself up to the mirror in relation to all of this stuff first and foremost, and how you react always. Doesn't matter, any side of the equation, I think is helpful, you know?
Yeah, you're right. It's comes down to us, you know. Well, listen, this has been such an awesome conversation. I can't wait to
That was a blast.
hear what our Canzine attendees think, and maybe we'll pop up in some people's zine reviews coming up or something. But I just wanted to just like again say to people watching, check out Amanda's Twitter. It's Miss MS Entropy is the handle, and also like if you haven't read the Hate Zines piece, please do. It'll be online now, and it's hopefully the just, you know, one of many instructive pieces we can use to better understand how zines work and how this weird world works. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Let me end the recording and then I will send it to you.